one thing that we all want as researchers is time. Time to write up our latest work, time to feel like we have a life. Surely that is not asking too much. Fortunately, it appears for me that time is on my side. Something kind of weird seems to happen when I work, and until recently I was unable to explain it. It was genuinely baffling. Journal articles, books, projects just seemed to happen. I had this really weird recurring argument with my most prolific co-author, where I would say to her, you need to be co-author on this paper, because I really didn't write hardly any of this. And she would say, no, you need to be co-author. You need to be lead author, because I feel like I hardly wrote any of this either. I've had a full teaching allocation in every position I've held based on workload models until I took my current position at Newcastle University 18 months ago. Yet, I've had time to run an international spin-out company, Fast Track Impact, work as a research lead for an international conservation charity, run a podcast, blog and magazine, manage 6 Twitter accounts, and advise the United Nations and governments around the world based on my research. Over the last 18 months, I've published 2 books, 3 if you include this one here today. I've published 14 peer-reviewed articles and submitted 15 grant proposals worth 6- and 7-figure sums, 4 of which I've won so far, bringing in over £2 million and externally funding over half of my salary. And I've done this whilst being Director of Engagement and Impact for my school, sitting on various university committees and working groups and training more than 2,000 researchers. Crucially, all this happened without working weekends and only working 2 evenings per week. Now, maybe this is a British thing, but over the years, this became increasingly embarrassing for me. There were 2 reasons for this. The first was that researchers who didn't know how much I worked assumed that there must be something wrong with me. I must be a workaholic or on some kind of spectrum, and I could kind of see them pitying my wife and family and feeling grateful that they had more normal lives. The second problem was that those who did know how much I worked kept asking me to mentor them, and they would come with great anticipation and discover that actually I had no idea how I did what I did. So, in an attempt to work out what was going on, I began to reach out to colleagues who had similar experiences. And talking to them, I realised that we were doing a number of similar things. So, to test a theory that was beginning to form in my mind, I did what any self-respecting researcher would do. I started to read. I read broadly, forming hypotheses that could link ideas from very different disciplines. And I also reached out to some of the world's most productive researchers based on their publications and citations, according to an analysis by Times Higher Education and their use of Elsevier's SciVal tool. And I asked them how they did what they did. Their answers, and the answers that emerged from my reading, both confirmed and extended my thinking. In this talk, I want to share with you what I learned. My goal is not to squeeze yet more productivity out of already overworked researchers. Most of us, I would argue, already feel performance managed and measured to within an inch of our lives by ever more demanding employers who increasingly seem to work more and more like businesses. Where did the time just to think go? I don't want to work any harder than I already do. I want to work easier. I want to be more productive so that I can get my thinking time back and have more free time. So, what would you expect the most productive researchers in the world to have in common? Workaholism? Being unrecognisable by their families? Burnout? Perhaps. Certainly what I suspected, but actually the reverse seems to be true. I managed to secure interviews with 4 of the people on the Times Higher Education's top 10 list. And two things stood out to me in what they told me. First, instead of recommending time management techniques, they talked about some surprising values that underpinned their success. They were at the top of their game and revered within their disciplines, and yet the two most common values they cited were humility and trust. Second, they claimed to have great work-life balance, and to me this seemed extraordinary. More than a third of UK academics responding to a 2012 UCU survey said that they worked more than 50 hours per week. 2 years later, that figure had risen to more than 2 in 5. Figures are similar in the US, and an ex-colleague of mine who I bumped into on the train recently told me that he had taken a 40% pay cut to go part-time so he could get his evenings and weekends back. He now works 40 hours a week. I learned from these researchers that the silver bullet is not a technique, it's a way of thinking. All of the researchers I spoke to had an uncommon ability to focus on the priorities that were most important to them. This values-based focus on priorities rather than tasks was the secret of their success. Rather than being full of pride over their achievements, I heard stories about the importance of being approachable and open to criticism. Rather than telling me about time management techniques to complete tasks faster, researchers told me how they prioritised their team, empowering and trusting others to work effectively with them. As a result of these values, there was no heavy heart at having to break off from their work when a colleague was in crisis, because this, their team, was their work. And they did not see themselves as any more important than their most junior colleagues. From this place of empathy, linked to their values, helping their colleagues became a core priority. And as a result, they had teams that powered them to success. Whatever your priorities, when you remember why you were doing what you were doing, you'll do it for the right reasons, and you'll do it better. I therefore focus on my most important priorities, and I spend time every day, even if it's just a small amount of time, pursuing those priorities. These things motivate me because I've chosen them based on an analysis of who I am or who I want to be. Rather than measuring my progress in terms of performance, I set myself learning targets that I know will take me closer to my goals. And I judge myself on whether or not I have done things that are consistent with my values each day. I call this the new SMART. Many of us have heard the old adage that to make things happen, you need goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. SMART. Based on what I read from disciplines as diverse as ecology and international development, as well as psychology and organisational development, I now develop value-based goals that are stretching, motivating, authentic, relational, and tailored to my unique strengths and capabilities. If you want to find out more about this approach, you can read about it in my book. Some of my priorities are work-related. For example, my desire to train as many researchers as I can around the world. Other priorities are non-work related, such as the priority to spend time with my young family, which helps me to avoid working weekends or evenings when I'm not travelling. Having a single-minded focus on these core priorities keeps me highly focused and motivated, and because I take sufficient time off, I remain energised and inspired by my work. Because I'm so clear about why I'm doing what I'm doing, it becomes easy to say no to all the things that take up most academics' time. The constant email, the meetings, the people-pleasing. It's like declining an important invitation because you have an equally important prior engagement, in this case to myself. Of course, depending on a person's career stage, there may be some things that are part of the job that you can't say no to. But I think when most people look hard, they discover that they can drop many tasks with few consequences. This may sound strange, but effectively I am saying that you can say yes to say no. Recall your most stretching, motivational, authentic, relational, and tailored goal, and the things you need to prioritize to reach it. Imagine yourself reaching those goals and feel inspired. Say yes to that, and you'll discover that saying no to anything that gets in its way becomes easy. Having said this, of course, you need to make sure that you don't allow your newfound ability to say no to make you selfish. We have to spend time helping others too, and this really clearly came out from my interviews. You don't have to spend the majority of your working day prioritising your own stuff, but make a habit of prioritising the things that are most important to you on a regular basis. It isn't that I'm necessarily working more intensively or harder. Rather, I have put clear boundaries on my time, so I'm forced to focus on only the most important things. And of course, this becomes a self-reinforcing cycle, as it becomes hugely motivational to realise the goals that are most important to you. The problem with a task that takes longer than expected lies, I would suggest, not with the task, but with the amount of time you allow that task to consume. When you limit the amount of time you give to a task, within reason of course, the end product is often as good, if not better, than if you had allowed the task to swallow double the time. The level of focused attention provided by a forced deadline can actually enable more focused and therefore sometimes better work. So spend time every day or every week working directly on your most important goals. Even if you only spend 10 minutes per day or per week, the impact of making incremental but regular progress can transform your levels of motivation and help you to become significantly more focused. But as I said at the beginning, I don't just want researchers to become more productive. I want us to be satisfied with what we produce, so satisfied that we are happy to work less. I believe that where we draw the line between work and home is largely arbitrary. There will always be unfinished tasks on our to-do list, no matter how late we work. If you worked 50% less time than your colleagues, and that forced you to prioritise better, you would not be 50% less productive. In fact, hour on hour, you would probably be more productive. And of course, you can't work well without resting well. If you're serious about becoming more productive, then you need to become serious about resting well. The alternative? Burnout, which of course leads me to my story. I start most of my trainings with one deceptively simple question, and I want to ask that question to you now. Why are you a researcher? Really, why? People's answers often reveal more about them than they realise. Some of us are simply curious. Some of us want to achieve social standing or want our work to have a legacy. Others perhaps just want to make a difference. But when we really interrogate our motives, what lies beneath these claims? Over the years, I've asked many of my collaborators why they became a researcher. And of course, many of them have redirected that question back at me. At first, it was easy to answer them. I was a researcher because I believed that my work could, in some small way, help make the world a better place. However, an increasing sense of self-doubt gradually began to creep over me, as I began to realise that my desire to make the world a better place was partly driven by a desire to somehow make up for the acts of a person who had made my world as a child so difficult. The reason it took me so long to recognise this undercurrent in my motivations was that I was afraid my self-examination would reveal me as a fraud. At the time, I was leading a research centre, and I was terrified of the idea that I might have built this position and all the years of work leading up to it on a delusion of grandeur. Two thoughts troubled me in particular. First, I wondered if I had fallen into academia because of the paint-by-numbers approach that it gives you to self-esteem. Work hard, get papers accepted in international journals, get a pat on the back from the world. Perhaps this explained why I found it so hard when my manuscripts were rejected. If my self-esteem depended on me being good enough to get published, then rejections were personal. In those days, for me, publishing and funding success didn't just tell me I was good enough as a researcher. It told me I was good enough as a person. It took the whole concept of publish or perish to a new level. The second troubling thought was that perhaps my entire career was not actually my own choice, but some psychological reaction. Was I where I was because of what happened to me as a child? If so, then surely my abuser, not I, was responsible for my success. And if that was the case, then I wasn't sure I wanted to be where I was anymore. The floodgates had opened. On some subconscious level, my colleagues seemed to sense that I no longer believed in myself. One by one, they started to leave the research centre. It was a cruel time. Eventually, it was just me and my PA doing all the work. And then one day I went to the printer and discovered a job application for a PA position in the local council. My PA arrived moments later to retrieve her printer, stopping short when she saw me holding her application. Rather than apologise, she told me that if I was wise, I would do the same thing. A year later, I was taking antidepressants. Somehow, in the midst of this darkness, I managed to find a new job. I targeted a job at a university that had a reputation for being friendly. The university I am standing in here today. My new boss, Hanifa, allowed me to drop to a 4-day week on full pay to undertake an intensive psychological recovery program that ended up taking almost a year. What I realised during that year changed who I was. Rather than being ashamed of my past, I started to value many of the characteristics that had been born of it. Instead of viewing my success as evidence of dysfunction, I started to view my success as harnessing and transforming the pain I had suffered into something good. I was retelling the story of a victim as the story of a survivor, transforming shame into victory. I was learning how to celebrate who I was in a balanced and realistic way, rather than through the temporary ego boosts of publication and funding success. Even if you are broadly happy with the reasons that you are a researcher, most of us have disempowering stories we tell about ourselves from time to time. Some of us are unaware of the stories we tell about ourselves, and some of us choose to ignore them. We do this because we are unaware of the power of these stories to demotivate us, and we do not appreciate how much motivation and energy we could gain by taking the effort to call these stories to consciousness and actually interrogate their veracity. Learning how to retell these stories is the most important way we can discover and embed motives based on our values, which will enrich and empower us, and so drive us, keep us focused, and enable us to stay the course. For this final segment of my talk, I want to turn the focus from me over to you. And I want you to try out one of the most powerful exercises that I have produced in my book. One of the reasons that retelling your story is so powerful in the way that we're about to try is that you're consciously linking your own narrative to your values. Your values, I would argue, are part of your identity. And so as we live out our new story, we reaffirm who we are and who we want to be. In this way, we become able to connect with some of the deepest and most empowering motives that are available to us. However, it can be challenging to find a more helpful, empowering story that is actually based on evidence and so is therefore believable. So, to make this easier, I'd like to share a practical technique that I use to help people discover more empowering stories that can motivate and empower them. So your first step is simply to draw a circle and draw a fairly large circle filling the majority of your page. And if you just put a dot in the middle of the circle, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a pie chart. But before you draw that pie chart, I would like you to have a think to start with about what you might be putting in that pie chart so you don't have to keep rubbing things out. So what I'd like you to do is to make a list. So it can just be a bullet list or just write the words down in a column next to your circle. Not in it yet, just next to it. And the things that I'm asking you to write down are the things that make you who you are as a person. What is your identity? How would you describe yourself? So you might consider things like your gender, your age, your race, your sexuality. If these are an important part of how you see yourself. You might include roles. For example, I am a father, I am a brother, I am a son. You may have other roles, for example, about the fact that you are a researcher and you are a teacher. You might be a mentor. You could include characteristics in there as well, such as being a perfectionist or being a caring or impatient person. You may describe yourself as spiritual, as creative. Whatever you want to, this is your moment now, and I'm going to give you a minute to think. List as many words as you can that you would say describe who you are as a person, your identity. As you're continuing to do that, I'd like you to begin to start evaluating this list and deciding which of these are the most important descriptors of who you are as a person, what your identity is. As I said, make sure this is about who you are. This is not necessarily anything to do with how much time you give to each of these parts of yourself. So there could be things that are in fact an important part of who you are, but that you no longer have time to spend on. For example, you could see yourself as a musician, despite the fact that since you had children, you haven't picked up your instrument. So have a think through your list, and the items that you think are most important descriptors of who you are now need to go into that pie chart. And what I would like you to do is to create the size of each segment of your pie chart to be proportional to how important each of these different aspects of your identity is. So we're grading these in kind of rank order, and then we're putting them onto the pie chart, and each segment now, its size is proportionate to how important it is as part of who you are. Not how you spend your time, but how important it is. What I'm going to get you to do now is 2 exercises based on what you've done here, which are going to take you to the level at which I want you to get by the end of this. So the first thing to do is to turn over the piece of paper and create another pie chart, or if you've got room you can put it next to it, but if you follow my instructions and it's big, turn it over, draw another circle, and this time what I'd like you to do is just transcribe each of the segments over to the new pie chart, but this time I would like you to make the size of the segments proportional to the amount of time you spend being in each of those parts of your identity. Now, this could be radically different to what it was in the first pie chart, or it may be remarkably similar. This is what my one looks like. Some people discover that important parts of their identity actually disappear altogether from the second pie chart because they never actually get to spend any time being that part of themselves. And some people actually need to add new segments to their pie chart that they would rather not have to reflect the time they spend in roles or other parts of themselves that they don't really want to be. You can see that my identity pie differs a bit from my time pie. And I can tell you that the difference is, fortunately for me, less significant now than it was the first time I did this exercise. And if you look, you can see that at this point in my life, I'm expressing my creative self through my research, but the time I spend working on research is squeezing out time for spiritual exploration and practice. So, as you have time, try and have a think about how different your time pie chart might look. If you can actually do it, but if nothing else, have a think. Is this radically different? Is this quite similar? And the next step, we're almost there, guys. Thank you for bearing with me. The next step, the final step, is that I would like you to try and list all of the values that underpin the different segments of your identity. Now, you can do this on either of those pie charts, and you can choose whether or not you want to do this for elements that are in your time chart that are not in your identity chart. The way that I tend to do this is I write it around the outside. I'm going to put a bit of an arrow to it, so here is a value that I think might underpin this part of my identity, this segment. Don't worry if you can't do it for all of them, do it for as many as you can. Some of the segments may actually be ready-made values. There could be some that are not underpinned by values at all. It may help to actually think about qualities or character traits instead of values that underpin each segment, or perhaps beliefs or principles that you think might underpin them. So, for example, when you think of your role as a researcher, you may realise how important values like honesty and integrity are to you. Or as you think about your identity as a parent, you might realise the value of patience and gentleness. So, looking at your identity chart and your time chart, whether in reality on both sides of the paper or in your mind's eye, I want you to ask yourself how similar or how different those charts are. If your answer is, you know what, they're quite similar, then I would argue that you are probably prioritising your time in ways that are consistent with and feeding into your sense of who you are or who you want to be. And you probably feel fairly satisfied with your work-life balance. If the two pie charts, on the other hand, are significantly different to each other, then you probably feel a sense of frustration on a fairly regular basis, and an uneasy sense of losing touch with yourself, or maybe even a fear that you might be turning into somebody that you don't want to be. If the parts of your identity that are much smaller or non-existent are the parts that are linked to important values in your time chart, then it is likely that you will feel quite a deep sense of dissonance. This dissonance, I would argue, is highly likely to demotivate you on a regular basis, leading to procrastination, making you question why you are doing the things that you are doing, making it harder and harder to motivate yourself. Fortunately, this exercise provides a clear solution to this problem. Clearly, you need to spend more time doing the things that are aligned with your identity and values if you want to reconnect with yourself and reaffirm or reshape your identity and values. If you don't, then you run the danger of becoming what you spend your time on. It won't happen overnight, but over the course of an entire career spent prioritising the wrong things, you may retire to discover that you've become a different person, a person you may or may not like. The way to do this, I would argue, is by telling a new story about yourself. A story that is based on the parts of yourself that you value most, whether or not you currently spend as much time as you would like in those parts of your identity. To embed this story in your day-to-day thinking, it needs to be an evidence-based and therefore believable story. This means that you have to actively look for evidence that you are, or at least have the potential to be, the things that you value most. We become the people we are day by day, one decision at a time. And of course, it's taken a lifetime of decisions to become who you are now. It therefore stands to reason that retelling your story in a way that reconnects you with your most powerful, values-based motives will take time. Only through sustained, consistent decisions to do the things that are most important to you, and saying no to the things that distract you from that ultimate purpose, can you rediscover or become the person you want to be. Your challenge, however, is to make consistent decisions in a highly inconsistent world. On a clear day, you can see the path ahead clearly, but in the midst of a storm, it's easy to become disorientated. In a moment of stress, we may make a decision that further skews our time away from the things that are most important to us. Sometimes that snap decision ends up changing the course of our lives. In those few seconds, all manner of subconscious motives may rise to the surface and make us come to a decision that we end up regretting. Therefore, I believe that you need to make a shortcut to the lessons that you have learned about yourself. Some sort of guiding principle or motto that you can hold in front of you at all times, ready to recall to the forefront of your consciousness as soon as you are faced with a challenging situation or decision. What you're doing is you are creating a direct line to your most powerful motives, which you will be able to access in the middle of the storm, no matter how disorientated and confused you might feel in the heat of the moment. Rather than powering down at the moment you need the strongest resolve, you can reconnect to empowering motives that help you make decisions you feel proud of. Therefore, one final step in my exercise is to look over the piece of paper you've been working on and to see if you can sum up your identity and values in a single, memorable, empowering word, phrase, metaphor, image, or motto. Take your paper home with you, spend some time thinking about this. If this is going to really empower you, you need to have instant, easy access to this guiding principle. And that's why it's so essential that it's short and it's memorable. Some people like to create some sort of visual metaphor to help them instantly bring their guiding principle to mind. Some people like to commit it to memory in other ways. I have a motto and a word. The word is empathy, which is accompanied in my mind by the image you can see on the screen, which I show in all my trainings, of my youngest daughter in my garden wearing my shoes, because of course, by definition, empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. My motto is knowledge through love, love through knowledge. I committed this to memory during a series of walks through the forest behind my house. And as I breathe in the smell of the forest and sense the winter morning sunlight through the trees, I remember. So, reflect on the sorts of things you might want to spend your time doing that will enable you to enact your guiding principle or motto that affirms your identity and values. This may mean changing some of your priorities in work. It may also be about working more efficiently, so you can spend more time doing certain things outside work, which have fallen by the wayside and which you now realise are actually really important to you. I started this talk and the process of writing my book back in February with a personal desire to understand how I and a small number of close colleagues were achieving higher than average levels of productivity. The answers to my questions took me, and I hope took you, to a much deeper level of personal reflection than I had anticipated. My first ever experience as a researcher was in the mountain forests of Uganda, and it showed me the beauty and value of the research process. When we arrived, the forest was a tangled mess of green, but when we left, I was able to read the history of that forest through the names of the species that grew there. In the same way, I hope that by studying your own motives, values, and identity today, you will have found priorities that were always there. You just couldn't see them clearly before. There is a good chance that you won't feel comfortable with everything you find in that self-examination. Our Ugandan forest ranger told us the history that the trees bore witness to, as he took us to a patch of undergrowth and showed us the burned corner posts of the house he had been born in. He proceeded to tell us how he had set it alight in his role as a park ranger, as part of a mass eviction decades earlier. Like that ranger and me, you may not feel proud of some of the things you find in the undergrowth. However, I hope, like me, that you are also able to find new, more empowering narratives in the tangled branches and roots of the forest that you have explored inside. These are narratives that accept and integrate your weaknesses and limitations as part of a broader conception of your strengths and overall character. Part of me hopes that as a result of this, you will become significantly more productive. Another part of me hopes for something far deeper, a new way of thinking about productivity, which is less about the way about the work you produce and more about the way you produce it. At the heart of my new book is a type of productivity that is about producing a clearer conception of you. It is about seeing your unique intrinsic value more clearly than ever before and being able to express that in your work life consciously from moment to moment. Remember why you first wanted to be a researcher. Remember your most inspiring achievement as a researcher. Remember who you are. When you remember why you're doing what you're doing, you'll do it for the right reasons and you'll do it better. The fact that this enables you to cut out unnecessary tasks and become highly focused and productive is merely a byproduct of reigniting your motivation and starting to seek your most important priorities. The lessons that you've learned today, I believe, will make you more productive, but they will also make you more satisfied with what you produce. And I hope they will enable you to be happy, working less, and being more. Thank you. Before I finish, I would like to give the very first ever copy of this book that has arrived on anyone's doorstep to Hanifa, because this book is actually dedicated to you. Hanifa, you gave me my big break at a time when I probably needed it the most. I would argue that you embody the kind of leader that I have described in the pages of this book based on my interviews and the research that I've done for this. And my hope is that one day I can be a leader of similar calibre. So thank you, and Hanifa, this is yours.
Thank you.
If you're interested in getting your own copy, I do not have copies with me here today. This, I guess, is partly a marketing pitch, but this is not fundamentally about selling books. This is about discussion, it's about thinking. This is now your chance to discuss, to interrogate me, to think about the issues that I have discussed. But of course, if you do want to get your own copy, then you can head over to Amazon for that. Thank you. Okay.
So quite overwhelmed by Mark's sort of dedication and getting the first copy of the book. I think I was probably doing something when I was supporting Mark, in which kind of my motto would be about supporting people and helping people to develop. So I didn't think I was doing anything out of the ordinary, but thank you very much for the dedication. Moving back to today's event, so the question I would ask is that I read a little bit of the highlights of your career, which I think you've been phenomenally successful and very productive. And that was before you were able to articulate what you talked about today, because the book wasn't there. You hadn't wrote it, but you were clearly living some of those ideas, but you really only articulated them in your research. So do you see now that having done the thinking and produced the book, that you were able to perhaps go to another level in terms of research?
Yeah.
The question. I'm thinking, so if you did that before you kind of could explain it, what can you do now that you can explain it?
Yeah, so for me, yes, I want to use this to take this to another level, but for me, that new level is actually, for me, fundamentally, at this point in my career, about working less and having even more free time, having more time for my hobbies, for my family, for the things that I'm passionate about. This is something that has developed over decades, something that has become increasingly clear to me over time. And for me, what was incredibly powerful was just sitting down and trying to understand, trying to analyse, trying to codify this in a way that could then empower others. And I believe that whether you're or not you have a physical mentor who can help you to do this stuff, reading this book can act as a mentor for you to try and shortcut you to some of the fundamental lessons that I've learned. And these are ways of thinking fundamentally, which is why this is quite a hard task to do. I think we've got all the tools, we've got the time management techniques probably coming out of our ears. For me, it's about how we use the techniques we know about in a new way of thinking fundamentally.
Hi. First of all, thanks for the talk. It's very interesting. One thing I have is that this entire talk was about going from whatever state we're in now to sort of empowering ourselves or our motivations. But of course, none of us is entirely static. There needs to be some amount of regular or irregular self-reflection to reevaluate. Do you have any thoughts on maybe how often that should be, or how you can maybe tell suddenly when your motivations have shifted?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, there is an emotional element to this. So as we were going through this pie chart, I suggested that actually what you're doing is you're diagnosing the cause of the dissonance, the unease, the unsettledness, the frustration, the procrastination, all these things. And for me, as I move into a new phase in my life, I get that increasing sense of friction, of this is harder than it is meant to be, that sense of dissonance, unease, that I feel on an emotional level, maybe at a physical level, a quickening of the heart. And I'm trying to pick up on what is the cause of that, where does that come from? And then trying to work through that to refocus my priorities, refocus what it is that I'm trying to do. Very often, it's actually because, you know what, I've lost sight of my original goals, my original priorities, and actually just coming back to that. So I'm working on I was working on two £20 million bids for the Global Challenges Research Fund. And last week I decided, you know what, this one that I've just been asked to go into, it's a great ego boost to be asked to do this. But you know what, I do not have time to do this. And actually when I interrogate myself, instantly I realise that sense of unease that, you know what, I'm making a mistake here, that nervousness, that oh no kind of feeling. Actually, why is that? Because you know what, actually, I don't need to do this. This is not actually helping me achieve my goals. And I was able to say no before I got in too deep to the second bid. So get that sense, key into it, bring it to consciousness, ask yourself why. Usually it's about coming back to your priorities, but actually it may be about reframing them if necessary.
So would you say it drives the choices that you then make if you kind of do that reconnection?
Exactly, and for me, the power of this is being able to do that minute to minute. So I think that the crucial challenge is that, you know, your head is so full of different stuff. You've got emails coming in, you've got phone calls coming in, whatever it is, you're traveling. And actually, the decision-making context that we find ourselves in is far from ideal. And as a result, I think we often make careless decisions that we end up regretting later on. And sometimes you can't get out of it, and fair enough, you have to live with that. And actually in my book I talk about how you can actually then find new joy in the old commitments that you have by reframing them in terms of things that can actually connect with what is most important to you. But yes, I would agree.
John,
Yeah, I have a number of questions, but I'll start with one. You said about unnecessary tasks, but unnecessary to who? I mean, they may be unnecessary for you, but they may be required by the organisation. So,
Yeah.
so how do you have to resolve that?
I agree. So there's a real tension here. In my book, I've looked at a number of things. There's a chapter looking at these kind of common tasks. So the tyranny of email, constant meetings or meetingitis, the review process. How many reviews do I need to do as a reviewer, as part of the academic community? A whole load of things like this. And I've given examples then of these kind of practical decisions that you have to make and how I'm prioritising them based on my values. And there is a balance, clearly. And I think one of the things that stood out to me is that these values that underpin this, one of these is it's about relational values. Right in the middle of those SMART goals is you're coming up with goals which are actually based on relationships, they're based on people, they're about giving. They're other-regarding rather than self-regarding, and that is part of the power of these kinds of priorities and goals. And as a result, people then conspire to help you. And so I would argue that we need to get that balance. And so I do try and make sure that I reply to all of the most important emails, and I go to the committee meetings that I have to go to. And I do my academic duty, but I have thought quite carefully about where I draw that line. And for me, I've drawn the line where I have. It's about deciding where you draw that line and looking at it in a more psychological way. So for me, actually, the problem with email, which I would argue is the number one thing that drains time, is actually the psychological power that email has, this nervousness that actually I haven't checked my email all day and oh no, what is sitting in there? And actually, you know what? Why do we give it so much power? And actually, if I were to go for 2 days without looking at my email, would the world end? Probably not. Now, I'm not saying that we should all just go on an email holiday, but I think we need to interrogate actually how we feel about our emails and what is our relationship to these things. And if we feel negative, if we feel afraid, if we feel dread, then actually where does that come from? And can we then take a much more empowered and controlled look at this and give it only as much power as it needs to have?
Yeah, you had a slide there where you say to revalue your choices, redo your choices. I remember is, are you acting according to your values? Say yes, say no. However, sometimes it's not that simple. Sometimes you are much more constrained. You can't say no.
Yeah.
And the way you look, you make it look too easy, too simple, that you can choose the path that you want. What do you think about that? Because sometimes it's not straightforward, but you think that one should pursue your goals, your values, no matter how, and even if you have to say either yes or no, you should still stick to your values at the back of your mind. I guess that's the message here.
Yes, I think you're right to critique that. And I think it depends where you are in your career as to how much power you have over what you do day to day. If, as a result of your career and the job you're in, you are unable to say no to a bunch of things that actually make you very unhappy, then I would argue that perhaps you're in the wrong career, and it's maybe worth looking beyond where you are at the moment. But for most of us, I would argue, even at an early career stage, there are things we can say no to. And in particular, it's those additional extracurricular things that you feel you have to say yes to that end up derailing your work-life balance. And interrogate yourself. That amazing invitation for that plenary talk, that incredible opportunity, whatever it is, that you just instinctively feel like you have to say yes to, actually, is that purely about your ego? And actually you find out when, for example, it turns out that you discover you were number 3 on the list and the first 2 people said no. Or actually it turns out that nobody turns up to your talk, or whatever it is, and then you suddenly think, well, why did I do this? And you lack motivation and it all comes crashing down. It's because actually you said yes for the wrong reasons. So, okay, fair enough. There are, at certain times in our career, many things that we cannot say no to. But for those additional things that could then actually take us away from our priorities, that could destroy our work-life balance, can we be a little bit more mindful about the motives that are going into those decisions so that we don't regret them?
So Mark, in response to I think both of those questions, is it much more about a cumulative effect rather than sort of individual transactions, which you're saying it's kind of if you've made the choice time and time again to say yes to things which are not aligned to your values, then you will end up not doing the things that are aligned because you've made that choice. And it's probably a more cumulative thing rather than a kind of, so once in a while you might say yes to something because you've got to do it. Cam, your point, you've got to do it. But it's like, if you're constantly doing things, then you're not going to create the time and space to, I mean, I'm associated for research, you're not going to create the time and space for research. And that's going to be, you know, a year's going to have passed, and when the conversation takes place of, well, what are your outputs this year, papers that we talked about, they won't have materialised because of those choices. That's how I kind of interpret it.
Yeah. So we've been writing a paper for a year ago, haven't we? So
Exactly.
I know how you feel.
Choices,
But I think that cumulative effect is really important to recognise because actually it creeps up on you. And actually, yes, to that little extra thing, well, you still have to find time for it. And it's those more important, longer term priorities that, well, I can do it later and I'll squeeze something in. But actually, in the end, it either doesn't happen or you end up having to make compromises with your work-life balance to make that
I think probably the
happen.
last question.
Yeah, one last question.
There's more of a comment actually. I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. And actually, I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough is that our mental health and we need to take time for it.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. It was remarkably difficult telling it in this setting, so I appreciate it. Brilliant.
That's great. So thank you very much.
Thank you.